At the time, it didn't look impressive. That's what made it invisible. No announcement, no emphasis, no attempt to frame it as important. Just a simple move made calmly, without urgency. The kind of decision people overlook because it doesn't match their idea of power. They were watching for drama, for effort, for something that looked intentional enough to fear. You gave them none of that. You acted once, cleanly, and moved on. They didn't stop you. They didn't question it. They barely registered it. Because in their minds, important moves look loud. They create disruption. They demand reaction. Yours didn't. It blended into the background of the moment so perfectly that it was mistaken for nothing. That's why no one responded. That's why no one resisted. And that's why it worked. The move wasn't designed to impress. It was designed to function. You weren't trying to signal intelligence. You were operating from it. And intelligence doesn't need witnesses to be effective. It only needs time. At first, nothing seemed different. The room stayed the same. The system continued. People assumed the moment had passed. But systems don't react immediately to precision. They reveal its impact later, when patterns start shifting without obvious cause. That's when attention turns backward. That's when people start asking, when things changed. And that's when your simple move re-enters the picture. Not as a memory, as a turning point they didn't see coming. They didn't notice the shift right away, because nothing gave way. Nothing announced failure. No alarms went off. The structure kept standing. Just slightly reoriented, outcomes started landing differently. Timelines stretched or shortened without explanation. Certain advantages stopped working the way they used to. At first, they blamed variables. Market conditions, other people, random noise. That's what you do when you don't want to admit you missed something obvious. But patterns don't lie for long. When the same adjustment keeps producing the same result, curiosity replaces denial. They started retracing steps, reviewing decisions, mapping inflection points. And that's when your move resurfaced, not as a bold play, as an anomaly, something small that didn't fit the before and after symmetry. You hadn't disrupted the system. You'd quietly repositioned yourself inside it. That's why the effect was delayed. Loud actions trigger immediate response. Precise actions trigger delayed consequences. They only show themselves once. Enough time has passed for cause and effect to separate. When they finally isolated the change, the discomfort set in. Because nothing about your move justified the weight it carried. Now, it looked too simple, too clean, too ordinary. Which meant the problem wasn't the move. It was their framework for understanding it. That's when the tone changed. The questions stopped being casual. They weren't asking what happened anymore. They were asking how something so small produced outcomes this disproportionate. That's when documentation begins. Not because they admire it, because they need to understand it. When institutions, teams, or systems can't explain a result, they don't dismiss it. They study it. They slow everything down and isolate variables. They strip emotion from the timeline and focus on sequence. And your move sits there quietly in the middle of the chain, unchanged. No hidden theatrics. No secondary maneuver. No follow-up push. Just one decision placed with accuracy and left alone. That's what unsettles them. There's nothing to critique, nothing to correct, nothing to reverse. You didn't exploit a weakness. You revealed an overlooked area. They realize now that while they were managing complexity, you simplified. While they were optimizing reactions, you adjusted position. While they were focused on momentum, you were focused on leverage that doesn't announce itself. The case study doesn't start with your intention. It starts with the effect. Because intention doesn't matter once results are undeniable. They don't care what you were thinking. They care that the system behaved differently after you acted. And once that's clear, the question becomes unavoidable. If this came from something so ordinary, what else have they been overlooking? That question is what turns observation into scrutiny. They stop looking for brilliance and start looking for positioning. They realize the move didn't need force because it didn't meet resistance. It went where resistance wasn't watching. You didn't confront the system. You stepped into a gap it assumed would stay empty. And gaps matter because they don't trigger defenses. By the time anyone notices, the geometry has already shifted. That's why the documentation reads strangely at first. There's no spike in activity to point to, no escalation curve, just a subtle reordering of influence. Decisions downstream start favoring different outcomes. Conversations tilt. Constraints loosen in places no one touched. It looks like drift until it doesn't. Until the drift forms a line. And once a line appears, they trace it back. Every path leads to the same moment. The same simple move. Not impressive. Not aggressive. Just correctly placed. They keep asking how you knew where to step. The truth is less dramatic than any clever explanation. You weren't predicting reactions. You were aligning with reality as it was, not as it was being described. You didn't need to outthink them. You needed to notice what was being overlooked. And seeing clearly is the most transferable advantage there is until it isn't. Because once they realize clarity did this, they also realize how rarely they operate from it. That realization is uncomfortable because it redirects attention inward. They can't fault execution. They can't accuse manipulation. They can't dismiss it as luck. The move holds up under every angle they apply. It was legal. It was reasonable. It was available to anyone. And yet no one else made it. That's when the analysis shifts away from tactics and toward perception, toward what people notice and what they filter out because it doesn't look important enough to matter. They see now that you weren't operating at their level of urgency. You were operating one layer below it, where structure decides outcomes before urgency ever has a chance. You didn't need to rush because the placement did the work for you. They document the restraint, the lack of follow-up, the absence of correction. You didn't adjust after the fact because adjustment would have introduced noise. You trusted the alignment and let time validate it. That's not showmanship. That's discipline. And discipline like that unsettles people because it suggests influence without display. They start asking whether the simplicity was intentional or incidental, whether you understood the consequences or simply allowed the situation to unfold. The longer they study it, the less that distinction matters. The effect remains the same. The system responded. The outcomes shifted. And the move that triggered it still looks ordinary on the page. That's the part they can't reconcile. Because if something so small could do this, then the system they rely on isn't as stable as they thought. That's when the documentation becomes formal. not because they want to credit you, but because they want to avoid missing it again. They start labeling behaviors, timing, placement, silence. The absence of reaction becomes a data point. The refusal to over-explain gets highlighted. They note how you didn't capitalize immediately, didn't rush to extract value, didn't alert anyone to what you'd done. Most people announce their leverage the moment they sense it. You didn't, you let it mature. And that patience changes everything, because leverage that's announced invites countermeasures. Leverage that stays quiet reshapes the environment before anyone can respond. They see now that your move didn't require recognition to function. It didn't need endorsement. It worked because it aligned with areas they weren't monitoring. You weren't faster. You were earlier than awareness, earlier than defense. And by the time awareness arrived, the move had already integrated into the system as a new normal. That's why reversal was no longer practical. You didn't trigger a moment. You created a condition. Conditions don't get debated. They get adapted to. And adaptation is the clearest signal that something lasting has taken hold. That's when the language around it changes. They stop calling it a decision and start calling it a pattern. Patterns don't belong to moments. They belong to operators. They begin to realize this wasn't an isolated act. It was a visible fragment of how you move when no one is watching. The simplicity wasn't minimal effort. It was minimal noise. You removed everything that didn't matter and left only what did. That's why they missed it. Their attention was trained on movement, not placement. On action, not position. Your move didn't announce intention. It revealed orientation. And orientation governs outcomes, long before action does. The case study starts to frame it that way. Not what you did, but where you stood when you did it. Not speed, but timing relative to awareness. They notice how you didn't need consensus to proceed. You didn't need confirmation to commit. You didn't need reaction to validate the choice. That independence alters the entire interpretation, because now they aren't studying a tactic. They're studying a way of operating that doesn't depend on immediate feedback. And that's harder to replicate than any clever move. You can copy actions. You can copy positioning without changing how you see. And that's where most attempts to repeat it fall apart. By this point, the case study isn't really about you anymore. It's about what their system failed to detect. They start asking questions that unsettle their assumptions. What else has been moving quietly while attention was fixed on spectacle? What other outcomes have already been shaped by small, unremarkable shifts they never logged as important? Your move becomes the reference example, not because it was complex, because it was clean. Clean moves don't attract attention at the moment. They matter. They attract attention later, when everything else is already adjusted around them. That's the paradox they struggle with. They're used to measuring intelligence by visibility, by articulation, by displays of control. You didn't display anything. You let structure do the work. The more they analyze it, the clearer it becomes that the real advantage wasn't insight. It was restraint. You didn't overfit the moment. You didn't chase certainty. You committed to alignment and allowed the environment to confirm it over time. That's why the case study feels unsettling to read. There's no hero moment, no dramatic pivot, just a calm action placed correctly and left alone. and that forces a conclusion they resist at first. The system didn't fall short because it lacked strength. It fell short because it prioritized noise. And noisy systems overlook quiet shifts every time. That realization changes how they look at everything afterward. They become more cautious around urgency, less impressed by force, more attentive to placement, because now they understand that what truly alters outcomes doesn't usually announce itself. It settles, it integrates. It becomes obvious only in hindsight. Your simple move keeps appearing in discussions as a reference point, not because it was clever, but because it revealed a blind spot they didn't know existed. They see now that while they were reacting to events, you were positioning for what would eventually happen. You didn't chase momentum. You placed yourself where momentum would pass through. That's why the documentation keeps circling back to the same descriptors. Ordinary, small, quiet. Those words don't explain the effect, but they describe it accurately. And accuracy matters more than explanation. They try to reduce it to steps, to frameworks, to rules they can apply next time. But every attempt feels incomplete, because the move itself wasn't the advantage. The perception that allowed you to see it was. You didn't need special information. You needed patience and clarity. And patience isn't teachable inside systems built on speed. That's why the case study ends without a directive they can act on. It describes what happened, but it can't prescribe how to reproduce it. And that's what gives it weight. And that's where the case study quietly stops. Not with a recommendation, not with a framework, with an acknowledgement they don't state directly. What shifted the outcome wasn't a tactic they can copy. It was a way of seeing they don't yet operate from. Your move looked ordinary because it wasn't designed to impress people who measure intelligence by motion. It was designed to align with how systems behave when no one is narrating them. You didn't outmaneuver anyone. You stepped out of the noise long enough to see where reality was already moving, then placed yourself there and stayed still. Everything else followed. That's why the documentation feels incomplete. They can record the sequence. They can chart the effects. They can even remind themselves to watch for small moves next time. But they can't produce the restraint that made it possible. Restraint that doesn't hesitate. Patience that doesn't second guess. Clarity that doesn't need confirmation. Your simple move became a case study, not because it was extraordinary, but because it revealed how much of their system depends on spectacle to feel in control. You didn't need control. You needed position. And position, once taken quietly and held without adjustment, doesn't ask permission to work. It just does. That's the part they keep rereading. Not to understand you, to understand what they overlooked. And the quiet truth they're left with is this. What looks ordinary in the moment often decides everything. By the time people recognize it, the outcome has already settled into place, and the part they don't include in the case study is the one that can't be measured. The silence afterward. The shift in how people behave once they realize outcomes can be shaped without noise, without authority, without spectacle. They don't document the hesitation that appears before future decisions. The extra pause before someone moves too quickly. The subtle awareness that something small, placed correctly, can undo months of effort if no one is paying attention. Your move didn't just affect one result. It changed how carefully they observe everything that follows. You became a reference point they don't name. A quiet reminder that influence isn't always visible, and intelligence isn't always loud. They don't say it openly, but they understand now that the system didn't reward brilliance. It responded to alignment, and alignment doesn't announce itself when it arrives. It proves itself later, when change can no longer be redirected. That's why your move still unsettles them. Not because it was clever, because it was clean. No excess, no correction, no follow-up explanation. Just placement, patience, and certainty. They expected complexity. They documented simplicity. And in doing so, they learned something they can't set aside. The most decisive shifts don't look like shifts at all. They look like nothing, until everything depends on them. And that's where it ends. Not with applause, not with imitation, with a lasting adjustment in how reality is interpreted. The case study closes, but the effect continues. People stop trusting noise as a signal of importance. They start watching placement, timing, and what remains steady when everything else reacts. Your move didn't teach them a trick. It revealed a principle they'd been overlooking, that outcomes are often shaped long before anyone notices the moment that caused them. You didn't rush to claim credit. You didn't return to explain. You let the results speak without narration. And that's why the conclusion holds. Because nothing about it depends on belief. It depends on evidence that accumulated quietly while attention was elsewhere. They expected complexity. They found clarity. They expected intention. They could debate. They found alignment they couldn't undo. Your simple move looked ordinary because it belonged exactly where it was placed. And things that belong don't announce themselves. They integrate. By the time people realize what mattered, discussion no longer changes anything. That's the lesson they carry forward, even if they never say it aloud. Precision doesn't need drama. Restraint doesn't need recognition. And the most decisive actions often pass unnoticed until they shape everything that follows. The last realization arrives without urgency, without surprise. Just acceptance. They understand that what unsettled them wasn't the result of your move, but what it implied. That the most influential decisions don't compete for attention. They operate beneath it. Your simple move didn't stand out because it wasn't meant to be seen. It was meant to be correct. And correctness doesn't need reinforcement. It compounds quietly. That's why the case study never quite satisfies them. It explains the sequence, but it doesn't restore certainty, because now they know something they can't set aside. While they were watching for brilliance, outcomes were being shaped elsewhere. While they were reacting to noise, position was being claimed without resistance. You didn't outthink the system. You stepped outside its assumptions and allowed it to reveal its own boundaries. Once that's seen clearly, ideas about control never feel the same again. They don't fear you. They don't idolize you. They recalibrate. They move with more care. They hesitate before dismissing what looks ordinary, because they learn the cost of overlooking simplicity placed with intent. Your move didn't rewrite the rules. It showed which ones mattered. And once those are visible, there's no returning to the belief that loudness equals power or complexity equals intelligence. The outcome was never dramatic. It was steady. And steadiness doesn't announce itself. It waits, integrates, and becomes undeniable in time. That's the final understanding they carry forward. long after the documentation ends. Hello, my dear mastermind. They saw your strategy before they ever saw your face. It showed up in rooms you were never invited into. It moved inside conversations you never spoke in. It reshaped decisions you never touched directly. And that's what unsettled them. Because influence usually leaves fingerprints. Power usually leaves noise. But yours arrived clean. No trail, no credit, no announcement. They studied the pattern and couldn't trace the source. That's when the whisper spread. They're playing a game we don't understand. And the more they tried to reverse engineer your moves, the clearer it became that the playbook had your shadow, but not your origin. They saw the effect without living the cause. They memorized outcomes without understanding alignment. They believed strategy could be copied like a formula. What they never realized is that your strategy isn't a technique. It's a consequence of who you became when nobody was watching. While they were busy learning moves, you were mastering restraint. While they were chasing leverage, you were building perception. While they were rehearsing control, you were dissolving dependency on approval. And that's why your decisions land with no resistance. That's why doors shift without force. That's why momentum bends toward you before you ask. They think someone leaked your methods. They think someone betrayed your blueprint. They think there's a mole somewhere feeding them information. But the truth is far colder than betrayal. You never gave anything away. They saw it because inevitability always leaves a signature. People don't copy power because they understand it. They copy it because they worry about falling behind it. And worry makes people sloppy. It makes them impatient. It makes them reach for surface instead of depth. You never stopped them from studying you. You just stopped explaining yourself. And that silence became heavier than any lesson you could have taught. This is where the real shift begins. When observation turns into obsession. When curiosity turns into concern. When imitation turns into exposure. Because now they aren't trying to win anymore. They're trying not to be left behind. And that's the weakest position a strategist can ever occupy. They started checking timestamps next. When did this shift begin? When did their advantage start leaking? When did the edge they were so proud of quietly dull? They traced graphs, compiled footage, pulled records, ran simulations that kept pointing to the same uncomfortable conclusion. You were always one move ahead before they even knew a move had been played. That's what unsettled them. Not that you were smarter in the obvious sense, but that you operated from a layer they couldn't access with data. They believed power came from visibility. You proved it comes from positioning. They believed speed was dominance. You showed them timing is supremacy. They believed pressure forces results. You revealed stillness creates inevitability. Every time they tried to accelerate past you, their momentum dispersed. Every time they tried to box you into a pattern, you slipped the frame without resistance. Because you never built your advantage on reaction. You built it on orientation. You decided who you were before the room decided who you could be. And that decision locked your direction long before their strategies caught up. They chase trends. You follow signals. They read the market. You read the temperature of intention. They optimize outputs. You refine identity. That's why their copy feels hollow while your presence feels anchored. They can repeat your steps, but they cannot reproduce your weight. They can mimic the surface of your moves, but they cannot access the core that makes them land. And every failed imitation tightens the pressure inside their own system. People who rely on duplication eventually get exposed by contrast, because copied strength fails under stress. Borrowed confidence weakens under uncertainty. Only integrated power holds its shape when conditions shift. That's what they're starting to feel now. The subtle concern that creeps in when technique stops carrying them. The quiet worry of realizing the person they tried to copy is no longer operating from a place they can reach. They thought strategy was transferable. They're learning too late that perspective isn't downloadable. It has to be earned in silence, in friction, in the spaces where nobody is watching how steady you stay, when the world doesn't validate you yet. That's when their focus shifted from copying your tactics to studying your temperament. They watched how you handled pressure when nothing went your way, how you moved when attention vanished, how you stayed centered when outcomes stalled, because that's the part they could never decode. Their strength depends on response. Yours exists before response even arrives. They escalate when challenged. You simplify. They tighten when uncertain. You widen your scope. They posture when pressured. You reduce motion. And that contrast exposes everything. They learned fast that your strategy isn't built on aggression. It's built on inevitability. You don't force outcomes. You allow conditions to mature until outcomes have no option but to arrive. That concerns people who depend on speed to feel powerful, because speed is only impressive when direction is missing. You never had that problem. You aligned early. You committed quietly. You cut excess without announcing reduction. And while they chased applause, you eliminated distraction. That's why your decisions feel surgical. No wasted motion. No emotional leakage, no need to over-explain. They don't feel concerned by your intellect alone. They feel concerned by your lack of hunger for their validation, because hungry people are predictable. Grounded people are not. The moment they realized they couldn't lure you into reaction, the real concern began. You weren't competing on their field. You weren't responding to their timeline. You weren't trying to win their game. You were constructing your own terrain while they argued about rules that no longer applied to you. They tried to lure you into revealing more with pressure. It didn't work. They tried to lure you with praise. It didn't work. They tried to pressure you with conflict. Still nothing. Because your leverage no longer lives in opposition. It lives in independence. And independence is the one asset no playbook can simulate. They can map behaviors. They can chart outcomes. They can rehearse scenarios. But they cannot replace the internal authority that comes from knowing exactly who you are without needing to prove it. That's the layer they keep missing. That's why every adjustment they make arrives late. They are trying to solve a presence that no longer requires approval to exist. That's when the rooms started shifting before you even entered them. Conversations stalled when your name surfaced. Decisions softened when your shadow crossed the agenda. People who once spoke with certainty began to hedge their statements, not because you challenged them, but because your existence had already rearranged their risk calculations. They realized something significant far too late. Your strategy wasn't built to dominate a moment. It was built to outlast systems. While they optimized for quarterly wins, you optimized for structural positioning. While they chased headlines, you quietly secured leverage that doesn't expire. That's why their copy keeps weakening. It's designed for performance. Yours is designed for permanence. They keep mistaking quiet for absence. They keep mistaking your distance for disengagement. What they don't see is that detachment is your sharpest edge. You don't need emotional proximity to influence trajectory. You don't need confrontation to assert gravity. You simply remain consistent while their certainty keeps failing under revision. They replay your past, trying to locate the turning point. They don't understand that the real pivot wasn't an action. It was a refusal. A refusal to chase approval. A refusal to hurry identity. A refusal to explain your vision to people who hadn't yet built the capacity to hold it. And that refusal is what severed you from the predictable path they were counting on. They wanted you legible. They wanted you boxed. They wanted your growth to follow a line they could forecast. But you chose evolution over visibility. And now, every time they try to anticipate your next move, they end up revealing how limited their frame has become. They don't realize they're no longer studying a strategy. They're studying a departure from everything they built their confidence on. And the deeper that realization sinks in, the more unstable their copy becomes. Now they don't even trust their own projections anymore. Every forecast feels provisional. Every assumption feels brittle. Because the one variable they can't stabilize is you. They realize that the most significant part of your rise was never acceleration. It was coherence. You didn't fragment under pressure. You didn't split your identity to survive rooms. You stayed whole while they kept rearranging masks. That's why your presence recalibrates environments without effort. You don't adapt to rooms. Rooms adapt to you. And they finally see the cost of misreading that early. They built counters for aggression. You arrived with clarity. They prepared defenses for force. You moved with gravity. They trained for opposition. You advanced through alignment. And alignment doesn't raise concerns until it's too late to stop it. They copied your moves, thinking they were stealing advantage. What they were actually stealing was timing out of context. Motion without meaning, technique without origin. That's why every attempt to replicate you feels delayed by one invisible beat. That's the beat where conviction lives. The beat where hesitation dies. The beat where you already decided, long before they ever detected a choice forming. And now they're stuck in reaction loops to a force that doesn't announce itself. They can't rush you because you're not running. They can't limit you because you're not confined to their map. They can't pressure you because you don't draw authority from their recognition. So they do what systems always do when they lose control. They escalate complexity, more rules, more oversight, more monitoring. But complexity never overcomes simplicity, rooted in identity. It only exposes how far it has drifted from purpose. And purpose is the one advantage they forgot to model when your strategy entered their playbook without your permission. That's when the irony fully locked in. The harder they worked to understand you, the further they moved from their own center. Their operations grew louder. Their planning grew heavier. Their movements grew frantic. Meanwhile, you grew quieter, not because you were shrinking, because you were concentrating. You didn't need to multiply effort anymore. You refined intention. You didn't expand noise. You deepened precision. And precision is invisible to people addicted to spectacle. They mistook your silence for withdrawal. They mistook your restraint for hesitation. They mistook your absence from the spotlight for weakness. What they never understood is that withdrawal is sometimes repositioning at a higher altitude. You weren't leaving the game. You were stepping above the grid they were confined to. That's why their pressure campaigns failed. That's why their provocations fell flat. That's why every attempt to pull you back into reaction failed on arrival. You had already graduated from the emotional economy they still depended on. Their chaos needs witnesses. Your stability does not. Their influence requires constant reinforcement. Yours regenerates from within. They borrowed structures. You built foundations. They pursued leverage through external validation. You cultivated authority through internal alignment. And now they sit watching the distance widen without any clear way to close it. Because distance created by speed can be chased. Distance created by evolution cannot. They keep studying the moves in their playbook, searching for the moment you gave something up. But the truth is simpler and colder than any betrayal narrative they invent. You didn't give anything away. You simply became someone whose presence writes patterns, whether you participate or not. And systems built on control always react strongly when influence no longer requires permission. And that's where the story resolves in silence, not spectacle. They keep scanning for leaks, for sources, for betrayals that never happened. They keep interrogating shadows, convinced that something must have been handed over, sold, or stolen. But the truth never changes. What entered their playbook wasn't a secret. It was a consequence of the way you chose to move when nobody was watching, a consequence of the discipline you kept when results were delayed, a consequence of the standard you held when shortcuts were everywhere. They're not studying your strategy anymore. They're studying the aftermath of a decision they never had the courage to make themselves. And that's why your calm unsettles them more than your success ever could. You're not rushing to defend your position. You're not racing to secure approval. You're not hurrying to protect status. You're already beyond the stage where proof is required. They wanted to borrow your mind without paying the price you paid to shape it. They wanted the outcome without the solitude, the authority without the inner reordering, the influence without the detachment. And that's why every move they make now feels heavier, slower, weaker, because power that isn't rooted in identity always fails when pressure rises. You didn't take their advantage. You outgrew the level where their advantage even mattered, and now the gap isn't closing, it's stabilizing. Not because you're accelerating, but because you're no longer visible on the axis. They still think determines power. They keep checking to see if you flinched, if you reacted, if you cared, but you already let all of that go. And the moment you stopped needing to be understood by them was the moment their entire framework stopped being relevant to you. Now everything feels inverted for them. The louder they try to assert relevance, the heavier your quiet becomes. The more they scramble to prove certainty, the clearer your detachment looks like command. You don't need to dominate the room to own the direction of it. You don't need to speak first to decide how the story bends. You don't need to react to pressure when your very stillness rewrites the temperature of the moment. They keep checking for signs that you're still invested in the outcome they care about. But you stepped out of that bargain long ago. You no longer trade energy for validation. You no longer exchange clarity for comfort. And that's the final separation they can't repair, because systems depend on participation to maintain control. The moment someone evolves beyond the need to participate emotionally, the entire structure starts leaking power around them. That's who you became, not a rival inside their frame, not a competitor on their field, but a reference point that sits outside their permission system entirely. And from this distance, their playbook looks small. Their noise sounds thin. Their urgency feels exposed. You're not ahead because you're chasing tomorrow. You're ahead because you fully exited yesterday. And once someone makes that exit cleanly, containment becomes impossible. The game shifts, the rules dissolve, and what remains is undeniable. You didn't just transcend their strategy. You made strategy itself irrelevant to your path. Hello, my dear mastermind. They thought you were random. That was the mistake. Not careless, not unplanned. Random. Because from the outside, your moves didn't line up with the patterns they were trained to recognize. You didn't escalate when pressure was applied. You didn't retreat when things went quiet. You didn't follow momentum just because it was there. To observers who rely on prediction to feel safe, that looks like chaos. But chaos reacts. Chaos flinches. Chaos leaves residue. You didn't. What they called unpredictability was actually consistency operating on a level they weren't watching. You weren't changing direction. You were moving along a line they couldn't see yet. That's why their reads kept failing. They were tracking behavior. You were operating from position. Behavior fluctuates. Position holds. They expected tells. You gave them structure. They expected impulse. You gave them timing. Every time they thought they'd figured you out. The next move didn't contradict the last one. It bypassed it. That's what confused them. They weren't watching randomness unfold. They were watching a system complete steps out of order, from their point of view. And systems only look unpredictable when you don't understand the logic driving them. They're just now realizing that nothing you did was accidental. They just weren't seeing the full map yet. They kept trying to simplify you, because simplification makes people feel in control. If they could label you impulsive, emotional, inconsistent, then every unexpected outcome could be dismissed as luck. That's what people do when they miss a pattern too many times. They downgrade the source. But over time, the misses stacked up. Too many correct outcomes, too many moments where your choices aged well while theirs needed revision. That's when discomfort set in. Because randomness doesn't compound. Randomness doesn't produce clean consequences that line up months later. Randomness doesn't leave behind coherence. You did. They began reviewing old interactions differently. Not to judge you, but to check themselves. Conversations they thought were forgettable suddenly felt deliberate. Pauses they once read as hesitation started looking like calibration. Moves they dismissed as detours revealed themselves as positioning. The dots were always there. They just weren't arranged for someone who needed predictability to feel secure. You weren't reacting to situations. You were letting situations reveal themselves before you moved. That's why your timing felt off to them. You weren't early or late. You were precise. And precision looks like unpredictability when people expect rhythm instead of accuracy. Once that realization started forming, it didn't arrive all at once. It crept in through contradictions they couldn't explain away anymore. Times when you declined obvious advantages and resulted in a stronger alignment later. Moments when you stayed silent while others rushed to speak, only for the situation to resolve in your favor without your input. They replayed those scenes and felt the unease of hindsight, because hindsight revealed order where they'd assumed disorder. You weren't improvising. You were sequencing. And sequencing doesn't look impressive in real time It looks uneventful. That's why they missed it. Their attention was trained on movement, not on placement, on reaction, not on restraint. You didn't take the shortest path. You took the correct one. And correct paths often look inefficient until the outcome locks in. That's when they started connecting the dots backward, noticing how each so-called unpredictable move reduced exposure, how each delay increased leverage, how each refusal narrowed variables. They realized you weren't changing tactics. You were narrowing the field until only one outcome remained. From the outside, it looked like inconsistency. From the inside, it was clear direction unfolding quietly. That clear direction is what finally broke their confidence in the old narrative. Because once you see a pattern, you can't unsee it. They noticed how your decisions didn't require correction, how you rarely had to explain yourself later, how outcomes didn't force you into damage control the way they did everyone else. You weren't adapting on the fly. You were operating from a framework that already accounted for delay, uncertainty, and resistance. That's why your moves aged better than theirs. While others were constantly updating positions to keep up with consequences, you stayed still and let consequences arrive exactly where you expected them to. They started realizing that what felt unpredictable wasn't instability. It was separation. You didn't expose yourself to every moment. You chose which moments were allowed to touch you. And people who can't see that distinction assume randomness because they don't recognize selective engagement. You weren't hard to predict because you were chaotic. You were hard to predict because you weren't available to be predicted. Your decisions didn't broadcast intent. They only revealed themselves after they were complete. And by the time the dots connected, the path was already behind you. Once the dots started connecting, the tone around you changed. Not louder, quieter. People stopped trying to forecast you in advance and started waiting to see what remained after things settled, because they realized prediction wasn't the tool here. Observation was. You didn't announce direction. You let direction emerge. And emergence doesn't give advance notice. That's why their early labels fell apart. Randomness implies lack of control. What they were seeing was internal control that didn't need signaling. You weren't responding to incentives. You were filtering them out. You weren't resisting pressure. You were operating where pressure had no traction. Every time they tried to model your behavior, the model failed for the same reason. It assumed you were optimizing for speed or visibility. You weren't. You were optimizing for outcomes that hold. Moves that don't need undoing don't need repetition. They only need to be placed once, correctly. And once they saw that pattern, the past reassembled itself with clarity they didn't expect. Nothing you did was a gamble. It only looked that way to people who confuse urgency with intelligence. That clarity produced discomfort for them. It meant the misses weren't bad luck. They were gaps in perception. They'd been watching the surface while you worked the structure. They focused on reactions because reactions are easy to measure. You focused on conditions because conditions decide everything before reaction ever matters. That's why they felt late to their own realization, because they were. You didn't change how you moved when recognition arrived. That was the confirmation. If it had been randomness, acknowledgement would have altered behavior. It didn't. You stayed aligned, and alignment doesn't spike when it's noticed. It holds. People stopped asking what you'd do next and started asking what had already been set in motion. That's when the dots fully connected. Not into a picture of unpredictability, but into a map of intent that never needed explanation. You weren't zigzagging. You were tracing a line that only makes sense once it's complete. And the last thing they understood was this: predictability isn't about knowing someone's next move. It's about knowing the rules they operate by. They never knew yours because you weren't operating on the rules they shared. You weren't unpredictable. You were principled in a way that didn't broadcast itself. You didn't move to be seen. You moved to be settled. That's why recognition arrived late and all at once. The dots didn't change. Their perspective did. And once it did, the conclusion became clear. You were never random. You were consistent at a depth they didn't think to look. Now that they see it, they stop trying to keep up. They stop trying to anticipate. They adjust their distance instead. Because patterns that reveal themselves only after the outcome don't invite prediction, they invite respect. What remains isn't mystery, it's recalibration. People stop mistaking clarity for chance and stop assuming silence means absence of intent. They move differently around you now. Not because they understand you, but because they understand themselves better. They learned that predictability isn't comfort, it's exposure. And that real consistency doesn't announce itself with rhythm or routine. It reveals itself only after outcomes refuse to be argued with. You didn't confuse them by changing. You confused them by staying aligned while everything else shifted. That's why the dots connected late. Not because they were hidden, but because they were quiet. Quiet enough to outlast noise. Quiet enough to survive scrutiny. Quiet enough to finish the work before anyone noticed it had begun. Now they don't ask what you'll do next. They assume it's already underway. And that assumption changes how close they stand, how fast they move, how much they rely on pressure to solve problems. You were never unpredictable. You were operating at a depth where prediction stops being useful. Once that's seen, it doesn't fade. It becomes the new baseline. And the truth they arrive at is simple and uncomfortable. They were never late because you were fast. They were late because you didn't leave clues along the way. You didn't leak intent through emotion. You didn't advertise direction through urgency. You didn't correct misunderstandings to guide perception. You let outcomes do the explaining, and outcomes don't argue. They settle. That's why the dots connected only after enough time had passed for resistance to fall away. Each result reinforced the last, until coincidence was no longer plausible. What they once called unpredictability revealed itself as discipline without display. You weren't changing strategies. You were reducing variables. You weren't surprising people. You were removing their assumptions one by one. Now that the pattern is visible, it doesn't make you easier to read. It makes you unnecessary to read. People stop trying to forecast your behavior and start accounting for your presence as a fixed condition. That's the shift that brings the arc to rest. You don't become legendary. You become reliable at a depth most people never reach. And reliability at that level doesn't invite anticipation. It invites adjustment. They finally connected the dots. Not to understand you better, but to understand why prediction never worked in the first place. You weren't unpredictable. You were already complete long before they started watching. And where it settles is here. People stop narrating you altogether. Narration is for things that are still in motion, still seeking validation, still open to influence. You aren't. The pattern doesn't need to be explained because it doesn't need to persuade. It holds quietly, without reinforcement. They no longer try to anticipate your moves because anticipation assumes access. They don't have it. They don't wait for signals because signals are for coordination. You don't coordinate, you resolve. That's the recalibration that lasts. You're no longer read as a sequence of choices. You're read as a condition that shapes outcomes before choice even enters the room. The dots didn't connect to reveal mystery. They connected to reveal certainty. And certainty doesn't invite curiosity. It invites distance, timing, restraint. People adjust upstream now. Before contact, before pressure, before expectation forms. Not because they fear you, because they understand the cost of misunderstanding alignment. You were never unpredictable. You were precise without display. And once that precision is recognized, it doesn't need to announce itself again. It simply becomes the standard. Everything else has to move around, and the last adjustment happens quietly, without ceremony. People stop trying to interpret you and start interpreting the space around you. They learn to watch what settles instead of what moves. They notice that outcomes stabilize faster when you're accounted for, even if you're not present. That's when it becomes clear this was never about unpredictability at all. It was about operating from a depth that doesn't leak signals. You didn't confuse them by being complex. You clarified everything by being exact. Once that lands, there's nothing left to pursue. No rematch. No curiosity spiral. No need for explanation. The dots don't reconnect again because they're already fixed in place. You become part of the environment, not the story. And environments don't get analyzed every time you enter them. They get respected. That's the shift they carry forward. Not admiration, not awe, orientation. The kind that alters timing before action and restraint before pressure. They finally connected the dots and realized the pattern wasn't forming in front of them. It had already closed behind you. And this is where it rests. Not with a reveal, not with recognition, with acceptance. They stop trying to figure you out because figuring implies something unfinished. You aren't. The pattern is closed. The logic is complete. What they finally understand is that predictability was never the point. Control was never the goal. Visibility was never required. You weren't operating to be understood. You were operating to be correct. And correctness doesn't need witnesses. It doesn't adjust when noticed. It doesn't sharpen when praised. It simply remains true. That's why nothing escalates after this realization. No one challenges it. No one tests it again. Because once a system recognizes a constant, it stops wasting energy trying to move it. It moves around it instead. Quietly. Efficiently. Without friction. They finally connected the dots and realized the pattern didn't emerge over time. It was always there. They were just late to seeing it. And once something is seen clearly at that depth, it doesn't become a story. It becomes structure. What holds after the story fades is not curiosity, but orientation. People don't reference you to explain outcomes anymore. They reference you to prevent mistakes. Timing gets cleaner. Assumptions thin out. Shortcuts lose appeal. The room learns without discussion, where precision lives and where noise falls away. That's the trace you leave, not influence that needs maintenance, but alignment that runs on its own. You aren't measured by what you do next, because next isn't the point. The pattern already did its work. Once it's seen, it doesn't repeat itself for proof. It becomes the floor everything else stands on. They finally understand that unpredictability was never your trait. It was their projection, born from not seeing depth when it's quiet. Now that they see it, there's nothing left to chase, no myth to build, no lesson to dramatize, just a recalibration that makes future choices simpler and cleaner. You don't move to be read. You don't signal to be followed. You hold position, and the environment adjusts before motion is required. That's what remains. Not an ending that asks for applause, but a standard that doesn't need one. And after that, there's nothing left to trace back to you. No breadcrumb trail, no signature move, no repeatable tell. The pattern doesn't point forward or backward anymore. It settles into the environment as fact. People stop asking how you do it and start acting as if it's already accounted for. Not because they understand you, but because they understand the cost of misunderstanding alignment. You aren't a variable to model. You're a constant they move around. Curiosity fades. Narratives dissolve. What remains is behavior that adjusts before pressure is applied, and restraint that arrives before noise has a chance to matter. You don't need to be present to hold the line. The line already exists. Once they connected the dots, they realized the picture wasn't forming ahead of them. It was complete behind you, and completeness doesn't invite commentary. It ends it.